Today we are going to begin sewing the tote bag, and so I have all of my pieces cut and bundled right now. I have my facing piece, I have my lining piece, and I also have my shell underneath it. I have the exact same bundle to put together on for this other side of the bag right underneath. So I'm going to really work with like one at a time first, and I'm going to stitch my pieces and then take a break so I can press everything cleanly and then proceed to the next step. The dimensions again for the tote bag are 4 inches by 18 inches for the facing. I have 12 inches high by 18 inches long for the lining, and then 15 inches high by 18 inches long for the shell. So the lining and the shell add up together. The lining and the facing add up together to create the measurement for the shell. And so I am working with muslin today, and muslin does not have a right side or a wrong side. So I want you to be conscious of that if you are working with a patterned fabric or a fabric that does have a face to it. You are going to want to sew all of your seams with the right sides or the face going together. We are not finishing any of these seams because the tote bag does have a lining, so you do not need to worry about that. If you have already cut your pieces, you should be sewing them so that directionally the pattern is going upwards towards the top of the bag. So the facing will be your indication of what is up. This is going to go at the very top of the inside of the bag. And so that would happen if you are working with a printed fabric that has a distinct upward facing print like a toile maybe, or even if you're working with a textured fabric like a velvet. So velvet has a distinct pile and it looks different whether it's going up or down and whether it's been cut that way. So you just want to be consistent in the direction that you're cutting textured fabric as well. This has been cut from a production pattern. So when I gave the measurements for each pattern piece, the seam allowance was included. So you don't see any drawn seam allowance on my tote bag right now. This is going to stay true and consistent with cutting out any garment pattern. So anytime you're working from a production pattern, you do not need to trace the seam allowance on it, so you won't have that in pencil, chalk, or wax. You're really just going with the outside edge shape and using that along with the seam allowance indication on your machine to align your pattern to sew it at the correct seam allowance. So I want you to be mindful of that. Even though you don't see it, we do have a 1/2 inch included on all of these pattern pieces because it was included on the production pattern. My order of sewing operations, I am going to construct the lining and the facing and join them as one first. And then I'm going to sew the lengthwise sides of the lining at the bottom to the other side of the lengthwise piece of the lining to create all one shape. And then I'm going to do that same process with the shell. I'm going to sew across the bottom at the 18-inch side from one shell piece to another. I will take a break at that point to go ahead and press everything open so that I can proceed to the next step. So I'm going to go ahead and start one by one really doing that and then put them together right now. So my first step is taking my first facing and lining piece. I'm going to move my bundle off to the side, and I'm going to stitch and back stitch the seam at a 1/2 inch. I am sewing with a dark thread so you can see everything I do today. And again, your stitch length should always be about a 3.5. Any larger and it becomes a gathering stitch, but it does not need. Okay, so I have sewn my first lining and facing piece. I'm gonna press this out with the iron, so I'm not going to bother with it right now. When I do press it with the iron, I'm going to press my seam allowance directionally up towards the top on the facing side. So the lining should be clean. I am going to understitch here, but I'll explain that when I get to it. So I'm just gonna set this aside, and I'm going to take my next lining and facing piece. Do the same over here. Again, because my fabric doesn't have a face, I'm going to sew it the exact same way. It'll come out perfect. So my second lining and facing. So my next step is I'm taking both of my lining and facing pieces, and I'm going to open them up and align them so that the facing pieces are towards each other. The right sides are together as far as the seam. The wrong sides are facing outward, so on both sides. And I'm going to flip it so that the bottom of the lining is towards me. And I'm going to go ahead and stitch ahead a ½ inch all the way across the bottom, creating one solid lining piece joining the two. I'm going to stitch and backstitch and sew at a ½ inch along this seam. So with that done, I have a fully constructed lining piece that opens up. Looks something like this. You should have a facing at each side. I'm going to go ahead and set that aside. I'm going to also wait to press that. And so now I will take my two shell pieces. So these are the only loose pieces at this point. And again, if you are working with just a woven cotton or something that doesn't have a direction, it doesn't matter which sides you sew. So I'm going to go ahead and sew along the length to create the bottom of the tote bag. And I'm stitching and back stitching the seam and sewing it at a ½ inch. So with that sewn, I am now going to go ahead and press open all of my seams so that they are completely open and flat. I'll press from both sides But when I'm done ironing, the seam should look clean pressed like that for both the bottom of the shell, the bottom of the lining, so do the same here, and also each facing piece, except the facing pieces are going to get pressed directionally upwards towards the facing, just like that. So I'll come back once all of my pieces are ironed. So now that I have my lining and facing pieces sewn on each side, as well as the underseam of, or the bottom seam of the lining, as well as the shell constructed, I'm going to go ahead and understitch my facing piece. So what understitching really does is it attaches the seam allowance towards the facing so that it does not pull down on the lining side. This would be really important if we were sewing something like a garment that had maybe a nylon lining connected to the shell material of the garment. You really don't want to see the lining pop out, so it attaches that seam allowance to the facing. It also, for the tote bag's purpose, it reinforces the facing and makes it a stronger element. So think about if you're going to carry books or something of significant weight into or place it into the tote bag, it's going to add some reinforcement so that the lining is not pulled upon and really doesn't tear. So I'm going to go ahead and begin my understitching. For the understitch, I am sewing about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam, and I'm sewing on the facing side, so not the lining side, and I'm catching all 3 layers. So I'm catching the facing itself and then both layers of the seam allowance here. So really find a marker on your foot that you want to keep consistent in line with the seam. For me, I'm going with the middle of the left prong of the presser foot. And so just by kind of following that visually down, I'll be able to sew my 1/8 of an inch away from that seam. I am going to back stitch at the beginning and end of this stitch line. Stop, take a peek, make sure that it's staying consistent. Okay, so when that is sewn, my facing should now look like this. I have the understitching about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. It's really clean. It's catching all of the seam allowance, so I should have a double row of stitching on the back side. I'm going to go ahead and flip it. So now that both of my facing pieces are understitched, I can go ahead and construct the side seams of the bag so that it can begin to stand up vertically. what I did not include in our measurements was really the base of the bag. So we're going to create a bottom for the tote bag so that it can sit on a surface. You can determine any kind of width you want the bottom to be. It could be, 5 inches, it could be 4 inches. I'm gonna go ahead and mark 1.5 inches on each side, measuring from the center lining seam that attaches each one. So I have a marker. So I'm going to go ahead and mark 1.5 inches. Just give myself a little notch on each side. I'm going to use the exact same measurement when I get to the shell piece. And so I'll do this on this side of the tote bag lining and also the other side. So that's really going to act as my stopping point. You can determine, again, any width, but whatever you do for the lining, you also have to do for the shell. Okay, so my next step, I'll leave the shell for now, is going to be folding up pieces of my lining so that, again, the right sides are towards each other. And I'm going to begin constructing this from the top down, so from the facing down, sewing it at 1/2 inch, stitching and back stitching at the beginning and end, and I'm going to stop at that notch that I just created for myself. So my side seam should look like this. I have sewn from the top down all the way. I have stopped and backstitched right at that notch. I did not go past it, so that's really important. I'm going to do the exact same thing with the other side, and it doesn't matter what side you begin at. I'll start at the top just to keep it consistent. So once I've done that, I'm going to repeat that process with the shell now. So I can set the lining aside. So measuring 1.5 inches on either side. I'm really only making that mark in the seam allowance so it never goes into the body of the tote bag. Same thing on the other side. So I'll fold my tote bag in half, and now begin constructing the side seam. Exactly the same as the lining. So stitching and back stitching at the beginning and end. So now for both of my bags, I have these open bottom shapes. What I am going to do is I'm going to twist the bag so that the opening is facing me. And I'm going to go ahead and square out the bottom so that the side seam of the bag makes a T shape with the bottom seam of the bag. What I'm going to do is fold open my seam allowance, just like so. And don't worry, this is probably the most complicated part. And I'm going to go ahead and stitch across that T shape. And I'm sewing that at a 1/2 inch. So when that seam is done, your bag will begin to be able to sit and really have a constructed base. So it's more flat at the bottom now. I'm going to do the exact same thing with the lining pieces now. So again, I'm opening up the side seam and aligning the side seam with the bottom seam of the tote bag. It's okay if you have to like negotiate it a little bit. I'm folding open that seam allowance so I can create the T and also right across that shape. Okay, so when both of those are sewn, I can begin to construct the top of the facing so that we can start our strap process. So what you are going to do is